Thank you so much. So hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to our brown bag session today on equity, diversity, and inclusion and teaching. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Angela Guadagno, the Academic Associate for Teaching and Learning Services at Desotel. I am joined by Professor Lisa Cohen today. Lisa, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lisa Cohen. I'm the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and a professor in organizational behavior.
Great, thank you so much. So before we get started, I am going to cover some of the logistics for the session. So this session is being recorded for our colleagues who are not able to join us. If you don't feel comfortable being seen or heard in the recording, please feel free to turn your video off or keep yourself on mute. Although we would, of course, appreciate your participation in our discussion. If you don't mind as well, I hear some background noise. So if you're not on mute, please also be sure to keep yourself on mute if you're not going to speak. Thank you so much. So the recording and slides will be available on the Desotel EDI and Desotel Teaching and Learning Services web pages following the session, and we'll let you know when those resources will be posted. If you have a question or you want to share your thoughts throughout the session, please raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you. Or type your comments in the chat for everyone to view. For our agenda today, we'd like to begin with an activity by asking you what you're trying to learn from this session. So what made you decide to join us today? So please share your thoughts using the chat function, and you can take a minute or so to reflect.
Yeah, and you can do that publicly or privately to either me or Angela if you don't feel like sharing it with everyone.
Exactly. Thank you, Lisa, for jumping in there.
Sure.
Perfect. So as you're reflecting on what you hope to gain from this session and what you're trying to learn today, as part of our introduction, Lisa will also share our objectives. So we recently conducted an EDI survey at Desotel. So Lisa will go over those objectives. We'll share some findings from the survey as well, go over some recurring themes and questions that came out. And finally, we'll end, and hopefully this will be the majority of the session, with generating ideas and an open discussion. Okay, perfect. So thank you so much. I see some comments coming in. That's fantastic. Okay, so Lisa, I'm going to hand it off to you for this next part.
Thanks. I'm just briefly going to remind people of what we were trying to do with this survey. We had 3 major goals. One was kind of a secret hidden one, and 2 were we were very honest about. We just wanted to learn whether and how EDI enters into teaching practices, both equity, diversity, and inclusion as topics specifically, but also in terms of your teaching practices. Do you use inclusive teaching practices? Second, we wanted to see if there were some points of light, look for some specific exemplar practices that everyone can learn from. And we also wanted to help people broaden their understanding of EDI in teaching practices. We wanted people actually to learn something by taking the survey. So some definitions just to get us started. These were all in the survey, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. Diversity, just to remind you, is when we're talking about people with different identities. It might be based on race or gender or a number of different categories. Equity, what we're really talking about there is fairness. Do we treat people fairly? It doesn't always equal equality. Equity and equality are not the same thing. Inclusion is about you have the diversity, you have people with different identities there. How do you make sure all of them, everyone in your classroom feels included? And inclusive teaching practices are really talking about the things in the back half of the survey, things like using gender neutral language, including speakers and cases with a diversity of people in them, making sure people can participate in activities. So those are our definitions. just some high level, can I have the next slide? Yeah, some things we noticed really quickly. We noticed these. One is that there was a great response rate. No social scientist ever gets an 81% response rate. And altogether, we had 87 people who completed it and completed it in good faith. It wasn't just one word answers. People really did write things there. There was significant awareness of the issues around EDI and we saw lots of things that people were doing. Also, there was some openness to having these conversations about EDI in teaching. People did say that they learned from the survey, and they outnumbered the people who complained about it. Let's just say that, which is an accomplishment. And people are really curious about how to do more with EDI, which is a lot of what I'm seeing in the chat. So.
Thanks, Lisa. So we're going to report out the findings from the survey now. We separated our findings into two categories. So the first is whether instructors include EDI topics in the curriculum, which is what I'll discuss now. And the next part of the survey had questions that were meant to better understand how you use concepts of EDI in teaching practices, which is what Lisa will discuss shortly. So we first asked instructors if they include equity, diversity, or inclusion topics in their course curriculum. And the results seem to suggest that 42% of respondents indeed include these topics in their courses, and over half of them do not. The numbers in front of the percentages, just so you know, are the number of respondents. When people did not include these topics, it was often because it wasn't related to the subject matter of the course. For instance, as we quoted from someone on the slide, when the course was about computer programming or quantitative investments, it was difficult to fit EDI into the curriculum in that case. Other people, so one person in particular also made some points that they don't treat these topics as being separate. So there does seem to be some overlap. And they don't necessarily teach about EDI topics, but they try to incorporate them in discussion. So in this particular case, they chose or selected some research papers that analyze implicit discrimination in credit scores, and they encourage students to debate on the consequences, in this case, of automation and credit scoring. Another person commented that they may not include EDI in the curriculum, but they deal with ethics. So how do ethics fit into that larger EDI picture? And that's also something to think about. To summarize our findings, as I mentioned, when people did not include EDI, it was often those statistics or finance courses where they didn't seem to fit. There's a really broad range of topics that people cover, and many of them are incredibly fascinating. Implicit bias, organ allocation. We've pulled a few quotes from the survey, and we want to share them with you briefly, but they will be available on our website for you to go through and read them afterwards. So for equity, some people include thought experiments, for instance. One person has a class on how societal structures and institutions can create unequal career opportunities. One comment that really fascinated us was this one: how to allocate cadaver organs, for instance, to patients in different demographic groups. And again, I won't go through all these. They're on the slide for your viewing afterwards. For diversity, we also had quite a few people who wrote how they include these topics in the curriculum. So one person said they dedicate an entire session to diversity. And what I found interesting is that they mentioned they didn't like how the textbook uses or treats the topic, and that they weren't maybe so fond of the language that was used. So they work around this by including thought experiments and cautioning students about social categories and personality tests that can be used as proxies for skills. So we have another example here. I'm going through these rather quickly, but it's just to give you an idea. Again, we come back to for diversity. This individual includes patient mixes, and they indicate different ethnicities, genders, ages. One individual took a different approach to including diversity. They dedicated an entire week to teaching about the experience of inequality in entrepreneurship and challenges that female and Black entrepreneurs face. So that was really interesting to read as well. And finally, some quotes for inclusion. Some look at innovation from the perspective of inclusion. And someone else indicated that they conduct labs with real data to show the dangers of artificial intelligence and profiling. So some very thoughtful comments from our colleagues. We're going to dive into practices now. Lisa, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, and just so you know, we're really just getting the very tip of the iceberg here. This is really rich data, and we're going to spend some time diving more deeply into it. And we're just speeding through it because I think the important part here is the conversation we're going to have after. So to speak about practices, Angela, next slide, please.
Yes.
So one thing that we saw that was really nice, gender neutral language. 67% of you said you use it. And we had some interesting comments, someone saying, you know, they don't have control over all of their materials, that this is a challenge because their first language is a gender neutral language. And so this is a big conversion for that person. People talked about using them when people explicitly asked for it versus he and she, and really working to be cautious there. Next slide. We also asked some questions about group activities and class monitoring. So we had a lot of people who gather feedback on class climate, which I think is a great practice, because if you do that and there's a problem, you can begin to think about fixing it. A lot of people do things to encourage different members of groups to speak out. So it's not always the sort of dominant leader who is doing the talking there. Next slide. Here we just are looking at diversity in guest speakers, and then we look at diversity in cases, the people represented in cases. And you can see there's a lot of variation here. People are pretty good at making sure they include women when they have cases. There are a lot of people who don't ever have cases, so it's not really relevant there. Racialized minorities are pretty commonly included. It's harder with things like Indigenous, underrepresented sexual orientation, or persons with disabilities. We see a very similar pattern when we look at the speaker selection and guest speakers. So yeah, 50% women, racialized minorities around the same. So a lot of variety. And one of the things that really came up here are questions about how can we do this? How can we get better at this? So yeah, next slide. So we're going to turn now, we sped through that, to the discussion, to specifically some issues that came up in the survey, and try to generate some ideas here, what ideas you have for addressing some of the issues that came forward. So
great. Thanks, Lisa. So in our survey, we asked people if they encourage students to provide feedback on the classroom climate, or to signal to you or a teaching assistant if they're concerned about being able to express themselves in your course. So we'd like to turn this question over to you and ask you what you can do to improve the classroom climate. And we'd like to have sort of a whiteboard slide annotation activity now. So to anonymously share your thoughts, we invite you to annotate on this slide. To access our annotation tools, at the top of your screen, you should see that I'm sharing my screen with you. And there should be an option to view options and then annotate. So we'll give you about a minute or so to take the time to think about what you can do to improve the EDI climate in classrooms. Sorry about that. So we have one comment. Someone likes to repeat and validate what students are sharing. That's fantastic. So I see another one looking at group leadership when using small groups. Absolutely. Oh, no worries. If you can't access the annotation tools, you can also use the chat function. Thank you, Brian. And I see Tatiana as well are messaging me. So thank you so much. No problem if you can't annotate. It can be in the chat, or we're going to open it up to discussion soon. Lisa, would you like to comment on any of these?
I think these are all great practices. Yeah, the having diversity in speakers, calling on students and calling on different students. I know I often find myself in the situation where I'm asking like the same 5 people talk all the time, and so I will ask that people who haven't spoken yet or speak instead. So that's great. Doing small group things is great. Doing things in breakout rooms also is great. All of these things really help.
Perfect. So should we move on to our next slide?
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for your contributions. So we'll save the annotations and we'll include them in the slides we distribute, so you can have these ideas moving forward. Okay, so I'm going to just clear the whiteboard, and Lisa, maybe you can discuss.
So one of the questions that came up quite a bit was, how do I select cases? And that's a problem no matter what. Now, and then we add to that, let's make sure we have diversity in cases. And if you use Harvard, you know that they're not always that diverse. A few things we're aware of that would be helpful here. One is that there are some compendiums, some lists of cases that have diverse protagonists in them. And so you can draw on those. I've also, I understand that Harvard will allow you to tailor things from time to time, to change the names to be consistent with what you're looking for. And then there's the really expensive option, which is to work to create your own. Carl, did you have something to add here?
Yeah, Lisa, no, it's something where I find my classes that I ask for volunteers, ask people to have questions or discussion, and only a small number volunteer, and I don't call on them because most of them have videos off, so I feel uncomfortable calling on them. They may not even be there occasionally, so I'm just uncomfortable with that. Maybe I'm not looking at it correctly.
I guess I'm not entirely certain. So you're saying you're not comfortable calling on people because they're talking too much, or
No.
because they're not there?
Well, so in class, I'll ask for comments and a small number will reply. Many of them have their cameras off. So I'm not entirely sure they're there, and I don't want to out them because they may have just gone use the bathroom, something very innocent, or they don't have the Wi-Fi. So it's something where I don't call on students. In the classroom, I will, but in the virtual classroom, I'm reticent to call on them. Maybe I'm looking at it incorrectly.
Right, you're reticent to cold call on people.
Yeah.
Is
in the Zoom classroom.
Correct. Yeah, I don't think I would have a different view on that. And it's hard because sometimes people don't seem to be there, and sometimes they don't have answers. I would ask people to have their Zoom on, their video on. I started out asking them not to, and it was really hard to convert them. So I'd start out with the assumption that it should be on, unless you need a bathroom break or something like that. Please don't take the computer to the bathroom. So those are the things I think about there. And Tatiana is writing something in the chat about warm calling. And I guess her way of doing that in Zoom would be to message them privately to ask if it's okay.
Well, what I do is that if they have a question on chat, I'll say, would you mind asking that on camera?
Yeah.
So otherwise I'll read it. But it's just something where
well, I think Tatiana is suggesting something different, which is that if nobody is answering and you have a question you want answered and you have someone you want to go to, just send them a private chat and say, Carl, I'd like to ask you, is that okay?
Yeah. It's just that I would normally have coffee with all my students in groups or the MBAs one-on-one, so I don't know them. They're just a picture, well, not even a picture. They're just a name. So I really don't know the students as well as I would for many years of having coffee, having dinner with the MBAs and so on. So I don't want to out someone, embarrass them, make them feel bad. So maybe I should be a little bit more, the word's not aggressive, but we also been told by Miguel, I may have misunderstood it, Lisa and Angela, that we're not allowed them to ask to turn their video on.
You can encourage them, you just can't require them.
Okay.
So you can encourage them, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
And no problem. And one thing I would suggest, maybe students wouldn't feel so comfortable to speak out in a large virtual classroom, but let's say if you put them into smaller breakout rooms, then Carl, you can hop around from one breakout room to another and get to know the students in smaller groups. In those cases, they may be more willing to have their video on, so you can actually have a more personal conversation with them in that way.
Oh no, I go to the chat rooms, but I wish I could sneak in. Like if they're talking in the classroom, I can just kind of lean over and not look them in the eye. But in the chat room, like they know I'm there and they go, "Hi, Carl," you know, and it's just something where I wish I could sneak in, but that's inappropriate as well, I guess.
Well, not in the breakout rooms. I think if you were to say, I'm going to be coming around in the breakout rooms.
Oh yeah, they know it. It's just that you can't, they just see you and they respond to it. Anyway.
Okay. That's good. Are there any other questions? I saw maybe a hand or two raised, but they seem to have gone down.
Jenny, you had your hand up. Oh, you're muted.
You. I was actually just going to mention what Tatiana brought up, so I'm very happy that she beat me to it.
Okay. Yeah, I know. The other thing, the breakout rooms are a great tool here, and you can ask people to go into breakout rooms and report out. I do the same thing in my classroom. I ask them to speak to each other first and then speak, and I get much more conversation that way because people get this commitment to their ideas and to talking. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Did anyone have any other ideas while we're on the topic of selecting cases of different places you can go for cases? Now, I had some luck last time I taught actually doing some live cases. So bringing in speakers to talk about problems they're facing and then having students work through those problems in breakout rooms and coming back to the class and reporting out. So that's another kind of thing you can do for selecting cases.
How long were those sessions, Lisa? Like, would they talk for 10 or 15 minutes or how did it work?
So I pre-recorded a segment with each of them where either I interviewed them or they just spoke about a certain topic. And then in the class, there was Q&A for maybe 15, 20 minutes because that's what people want with speakers. And then they presented their problem relatively quickly. And there were short case discussions on it, but the students really responded well to that. Next slide, Angela. So the other piece, another piece here is we're looking for diversity in speakers. How do you accomplish that? First of all, speakers alone, it's often difficult to find them. And there is some help available in school through the UA office. We have this board of Days Hotel experts, and we're aware that that's a list that itself could be more diverse, and people are actively working on diversifying that list. Another thing, ask your more senior colleagues or people who've taught the class before. Ask CAS faculty. They are and lecturers. They're great resources because they are often much more in the world than we are. Another piece is I guess this happens when you get old. Your students actually get more experienced and older, and you can invite them back as speakers later on. So those are some things. Any other ideas about how to find speakers? And Tatiana is saying she finds her speakers through LinkedIn, through specific searches, depending on the topics she wants to cover. Basically, she's stalking professionally. Yeah.
I do that on LinkedIn, but I find McGill alumni are very open to coming to class. And I've taught for 20 years at McGill, so I know a gazillion people, but even people I have never met, never taught, are very open to coming to class by Zoom for a bit, like astonishingly open.
Yeah, I know. One issue is that we might not be finding the diversity we're trying to find in our alumni. So that's something to be aware of. For instance, our MBA program is rarely more than 30% women. So that creates an issue, potential issue there. Other ideas about speakers? Next, Stephanie. Wow. Okay, we're being really speedy here. We can just have a general conversation after it. We just want to ask the general question about what we should do going forward, especially, and I'm happy to take any ideas about what EDI should learn, but I'm more interested in how we can help you to further embed EDI in your teaching. So any thoughts here? Write in the chat, raise your hand.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Thank you.
If anybody wants Indigenous speakers, I started with one of my Indigenous students, a column for the Globe Mail, a weekly column interviewing Indigenous leaders. So I've got dozens of them I've talked to. So, and more are women than men. I've actually, the first 6 women columns are going to be all women, and we said we need to have a man in there. So it was quite a happy problem to have, but a lot of Indigenous leaders in all sorts of industries. So if you're looking for someone, let me know, send an email, and we'll find someone I've interviewed so I know they're good. And we can probably give you eventually a column in the Globe Mail and send it to your students. So you go, pretty impressive person.
Yeah, that's great. Brian?
Yeah, so I guess one of the topics is that I think particularly this group is good at looking for opportunities to bring in diverse perspectives. One of the things that might be worth some discussion is whenever I'm in class, the dealing with students who have, I guess I would more troglodyte views on diversity is, I guess, is something that I feel like I deal with, every class, every semester, but it's always different, always unique, and it's always kind of off the cuff, and I'm never quite sure if I'm dealing with it well or not. So kind of how to, people coming from perspectives where they think, oh, well, maybe women are just less good at blank, or maybe, that the current distribution of leadership is actually based on a meritocratic system or something like that. Yeah, so I find myself dealing with that in an ad hoc way every year. And so, I don't know, that's something that I'd like to be able to hear other people's ideas about.
And I have no ideas here. I struggle with the same thing, Brian. I don't have a clear answer on what we should do. And in fact, Angela and I have been participating in this academic leadership forum discussion about academic controversies, and I found myself really asking questions about, you know, you're trying to tell me about the process, but I don't even know the content of how I should respond. I think ideally we could come up with some broad guidelines that might be helpful, but I'm open to any ideas. Desmond, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering something like, would it be helpful for someone like Angela, not necessary to be you, right? But someone like that third party to try to educate the students a little bit. So they would come into class like talking about wellness, right? But this is talking about EDI. So, because the thing is, like, if it's coming from someone like me or you or Brian, it gets a little bit too personal, right? So what we want is to have a third party to tell them this is what is the right way to deal with it. Because the thing is, even for us, we're in this round back now, because even for us, sometimes we are struggling, don't know how to deal with. And for the students, it's even getting harder because many of them, I teach mostly undergraduate, they're 18, 19 years old, right? So sometimes it's not like they are not respecting this, but they don't know how to deal with. And also we have to admit that a lot of times it's the family, it's the parents, that they give them these values that may not be right for us. It may not be correct under what we think and from the McGill perspective. So that's one of the suggestions, because we are starting this EDI. I think this is one thing that would not be too difficult to do a 5-10 minute seminars of respect, equity, diversity, inclusion, to try to teach students that we respect and appreciate and we value these things highly. So no matter where you come from, when you're at McGill and you're McGill students, you're McGill, the McGill family, then this is something that you have to respect and learn.
Right.
Thank you, Desmond. Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
And I'm trying to think, like, where does that go? Is that orientation material? Is that and how much do we need precisely? And would that address? I think Brian would still face some of the issues that he's talking about, where somebody just comes out and says something that you're not comfortable with. Like, what do you do? Do you call them out for saying it? No, I don't think that's what you do.
I don't think that solves Brian's problems, and I have this situation in class. But what I'm trying to say is, like, I don't have a solution for that part, but it's more like a preventive, more like an education from early on kind of way. So it's two different things, right? So that's what I'm thinking is, like, at least they got exposed to the ideas and ideals of McGill's and how we run our show, basically.
Yeah. Seku?
I think it's an interesting question that you asked, Brian. I think there's also, you know, the difficulty in the classroom is that there's kind of a factual dimension and a values-based dimension here. And sort of some of these opinions say, you know, men are good at this, women are good at that, are sort of, you know, factual claims or empirical claims. And so, you know, in order to respond to them appropriately, you would basically need to have you know, access to evidence. From what I can tell, you know, gender differences in psychology, that there's very little evidence of any, but sort of, you know, that's a pretty big literature, and it is one thing. And we're an academic institution, so, you know, knowledge claims need to be processed somehow. But then there's, of course, the values-based dimension, which I guess is easier in our setting, because we do have pretty clear guidelines on equity principles and mutual respect and so on. So, you know, you make a claim that, for instance, I had one young male student who made a claim that women like flowers more than men, and men are better leaders and women like flowers more than men. So this was, and I had to step in because he was about to be mugged by the class. But sort of this is one example. So there's a pretty stupid claim, I guess, and sort of there's no evidence that women sort of instinctively like flowers better than men, nor is there evidence that men are better leaders. But that does require a bit of digging, and perhaps it would be actually pretty interesting for us to do a little bit of a review of sort of where does the research stand. So if claims like those come up, then sort of they're easier to address. For instance, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems that gender differences, that there's very little evidence of any. Because that's a difficult thing. We can't just, even though there's a semi sort of empirical claim that gets made in the classroom, if you're a professor and said that that's not true, then sort of, you do need to be able to back it up with something.
I think there's a challenge here because we can never be prepared for everything that's going to come at us, right? Men are better at math. I can probably respond to that one, but there are a lot of them I just don't know the evidence on, and I can't rely on that. Rose, you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to mention something. I think someone has said it before. I think it's important, and for me, I'm also I'm trying to put myself in the shoes as a student. It's a lot of times, most of us who come from different countries don't know so many things. Before I went for my master's in the US, I didn't know so much about racism. I didn't know much about so many important topics. And when I hear them, I see my fellow Black brothers and sisters, I see them as people that are overdoing things. Until I sat down and learned about a lot of things and understood what people have gone through, then I began to know more. If I was told in my coming into the US that, oh, in America, we have situations like this, we're going through situations like this. So understand when someone says this is what they mean, it would have helped me a lot to sympathize with them on the topic. So I agree that like a pre-information of what the values are, on what these things are, where we stand at the university and where the department and faculty stands on different topics will help students be more articulate to different things. I know when I came to McGill, there was my courses thing on It Takes All of Us. It's a sexual assault thing. I can't remember the name now. So that helps me to get familiar with some topics and know what was going on concerning some things. So something like that, like a pre-introduction. I understand that it might be overwhelming. I understand that student might not do it. I understand that students might not even want to look at it, but to be sincere, I ended up doing it because I got tons of emails from the university saying, you need to complete it by this date, you need to complete it by this date. So it might seem like it's not working, but it does work. At least out of 1,000 people, 2 people or 10 people getting to know, it's a plus.
Yeah, and indeed there is some work being done to develop a similar program on race at the university level. I'm not sure when that will be rolled out or what it will look like, but we're still going to face the in your face, I don't like what the student says, I don't know what to do about it. And one thing that's clear, I think it's almost impossible to respond to the student in the moment. You might need to sort of stop the conversation and talk to them outside of class when it's less heated and less public. Daphne?
I was thinking one thing that we could do is, instead of feeling like we need to improvise to these responses, start gathering over time common stereotypes that emerge from discussions and having like prepared readings for students that you could say, well, if you're interested in learning more. So I noticed in my Black entrepreneurship class, the concept of affirmative action kept coming up over and over again. I didn't expect for it to come up. So I started to say to each of my sections, okay, well, you're interested in, we're discussing affirmative action, like let's actually read about it, and then gave them further reading. So to have almost like routines like ready to respond, because most of the students are going to probably be saying the similar stereotypes over and over again, I think. We'll find in our classes over conversations like these.
Right, and it might be nice if there was something at the school or the university level to help people with those responses, like to put together a guide to readings that you might want to give people in certain situations. Brian said, EDI website. Well, it's not a website, it's a web page. And we don't have that right now, but yeah, that's something to think about, or something for TLS to think about too. Desmond.
Yeah, but can we not actually, Brian has a point, can we not use our web page to start with something like that with the educations of the students? And it would be similar, like Rose was saying, exactly, something like it takes all of us, right? Because it would actually bring people at least to the similar ideas and value, to expose them to these values to start with. Maybe they didn't do it intentionally. I mean, still doesn't solve the problems that we have in class, right? But hopefully that would actually, well, try to direct them into the right direction.
We do have some best practices and guidelines for equitable and inclusive learning at McGill. So what we can do, Lisa, is potentially share links to those important resources on our webpage, but maybe try to publicize them a little bit more.
Yeah, because the students, when they come into classrooms, they would have never be exposed, because we can put it there, right? But I think then we can start doing the next step, which is to promote and advertise that, like what we show in terms of the other things that we would actually discuss in the course outline, for example, right? And then we can actually spend 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning to talk about, well, this is the value of McGill. If you're interested, please go to the website. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for that suggestion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it also might make sense to do a brown bag on how to respond to these sorts of things, and bring in someone who has some expertise on that. Angela, can you, or Jenny, can you think of someone we could bring in for that?
Off the top of my head, maybe not.
But, I'm sorry.
No, that's totally okay. But I'm sure we can find someone. Jenny, do you have anyone in mind?
I can imagine that perhaps that could be a collaboration with members of the equity team.
Yes.
So with colleagues in Angela Campbell's office. And that could certainly, the way that could be framed would depend on the specific inquiry and the specific aims. But I recognize that when we think about values modification, that's not necessarily a one-time thing. So that could be an ongoing conversation.
This is a huge project, not a single intervention, I guess. Seko, you're on mute.
Yeah, one sort of further opportunity that I would encourage everybody to look at in their classes, if you use small groups and if you have situations where you have one member of the group either reporting in, or in particular, if you have say, debate settings where you sort of have a group prepare a champion, and then sort of I've done that over several years in the social context of business, and it seems that sort of I tend to get all male panels almost every year when I do that several times a year. And sort of if you have say six groups in a classroom, which is kind of basically distributed pretty equally, so the chances of that being random is very, very low. And sort of whenever that happens, I do, and it tends to happen every time I teach it, I sort of blow the whistle and I have them sort of reshuffle the champions, and then we have and have them think about it for the next class, and then we have a conversation okay, so then we have a conversation about sort of why would this happen? So is this truly random? I show them the mathematics actually often that I think that the percentages of it is like 2 or something, so it's very low. And then I have a show of hands, and it's funny, often in the show of hands, almost 50% of the class feels that sort of this truly is random. And so this event was just random. But it kind of then leads to a pretty interesting discussion, because they're thinking about themselves, they're thinking about also the subtle sort of social mechanisms, on sort of who gets encouraged by the group and sort of why do they feel encouraged and stuff. So I think that's one real life setting where you can sort of do it, it's a bit sensitive, and sort of it's important not to shame the men who volunteer, because volunteering is obviously something that we want to encourage, but sort of I found it doable. And and I think that's one of the places we do see a gender imbalance, that sort of we have pretty equally distributed classrooms nowadays, and typical classroom activity, I think that's pretty equally distributed. Sort of people raise their hands. I haven't seen any major sort of, well, I don't know. So, I don't think that sort of women volunteer fewer opinions than men, but when they have to, represent the group, I think then it's my observation that this tends to happen.
Yeah. Carl?
Yeah, I'll volunteer. My co-author, who's a graduate student, Indigenous graduate student education, went to Dartmouth, Harvard undergrad, and then to McGill. Incredibly smart person who's Indigenous and could talk to Indigenous issues and how to approach it. I'm learning as I go along things I can't say. I can't ever say I'm helping Indigenous people, because that's patriarchal and white male things going on. So and you go, okay, fine. Like, she just tells me what I can't and can say, and it's all fine stuff. So she'd be a great guide if you want a shorter long session. I'll volunteer her, but it's up to her if she has the time, obviously. But she's just to do a great job. She's helping educate me, that's for sure.
Great. Thanks for that suggestion. And I think we should wrap up to give people time for their next meetings. Thank you all for your comments and your suggestions, and for showing up for this event. If you have other questions and other ideas about what we should be doing in this and other forums, I think by now you all know where to find me or Angela. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa and Angela.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.